All right, hi everyone. We're gonna fill up our room. We've got a bunch of networking going on. We've had a great kickoff session. 754 people for this session. We've got 235 of you here live with us. Just before I get started, I want to just remind our audience that you can use the chat to have an ongoing conversation. There's also a Q&A area where you can either ask your questions or upvote other people's questions. And we're going to have 3 questions to get started with our panel, but we're going to be going to that Q&A really quickly. So we want to hear what you think. All right, everyone, I'm Ben Kornell from Edtech Insiders. A special shout out to our sponsors, AWS. They have a new startup innovation program where you can get $100,000 in credits, and they've sponsored this conference, as well as Tuck Advisors and Magic EdTech, which have been season-long sponsors for EdTech Insiders. Today, I am joined by a stellar crew. We have Sean Jansapar, Director of Engineering at Khan Academy's Conmigo. I'm sure you've heard of it. Pedro Lucca, joining us from Brazil, CEO and co-founder of Ursula, and Dr. Wayne Holmes, Associate Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Education at University College London, and rounding it out, the man with the best headshot in all of education, I'm convinced, John Gamba, Entrepreneur in Residence and Director of Innovative Programs at University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, panel. It's so great to have you here.
Great to be here, Ben.
All right, we're going to do a quick whip around and just talk a little bit about who we are and what our organization is. And the softball question is, what is the role of AI as a teaching assistant that either you see in your product or that you see in the space? So a little bit about you, your company, and the role of AI as a teaching assistant. I'm going to go in the order that I introduced you. So Sean, let's kick it off.
For sure. Hi. My name is Sean, Director of Engineering at Khan Academy, and also been playing a product manager hat with Conmigo, which has been really fun. In terms of where I see AI playing a role in assisting teachers in the classroom, I think the reality is it's already here, right? I think one of the biggest use cases of ChatGPT has been teachers and students using it to get help, to plan lessons. I think even you started to see the traffic of ChatGPT over the summer drop, and I don't know if it's for sure the case, but I think probably a big part of that is summer school. So I think these technologies are here to stay. In terms of where we come into play, we've been building tools via the Conmigo platform, which is a teaching assistant for every student and a tutor for every student and a teaching assistant for every teacher. And we've been building a lot of tools for teachers just to help them with lesson planning. We've built kind of an experience that we do a lot of prompting underneath the hood to make that experience even better. But we also have this extra element of thousands upon thousands of users using Khan Academy. And so those teachers can get extra insights about how their classes are doing. They can get a snapshot of their classroom and just a whole bunch of other extra features for teachers that we've been building on top of LLMs.
Wonderful. And if people want to check that out, go to the Khan Academy site and you can dive in to the deep end and see how that works. Pedro, can you talk to us a little bit about the learner co-pilot that you've been building, and also a little bit about your unique background that brought you to AI and learning?
Yeah, sounds good. So as for my background, I've worked for a YC-backed EdTech here in Brazil, in a space similar to Lambda School before, where we had cohort-based courses with a huge emphasis on tutoring sessions. And I've experienced firsthand how impactful it could be on the trajectory of student, but also how hard it was to scale and how hard it was to replicate the results. And a couple of years later, I've worked for another YC-backed attacking the generative AI space, where it's using generative AI to be like copilots for sales, so on and so forth. I started to wonder if I could not leverage this technology to solve the problem of making tailored one-on-one education accessible at scale. So this is where the idea for Ursula came from. We're a young, stellar team of 3. We've been using the last 7 months to explore how a tutor lives inside a digital space. Like, it's way different than it is in a flesh and bones environment, pen and paper environment. We've been trying a couple of things, right? Like we've been using vector databases, chatbots, other gamification systems, but ultimately the way I see LLMs and AI in education work is by leveraging student engagement. Like LLMs can be used to create a figure, like a companion that students have an emotional connection to. And then if they're emotionally invested in using this, the long-term commitment necessary to actually develop and learn is there. This was not the case into other AI technologies so far, but I don't think education has a content problem nowadays. I think it's more as of an engagement problem, how that lives in a digitally native environment.
Yeah, such a great insight. And Jason Palmer in our last session said AI is not a product. It is a component of delivering more effective products potentially. And this engagement element seems like it has the potential to be a breakthrough. So we're so excited to have Dr. Wayne Holmes here. Alex and I have been reading your research. You also have really great advice and frameworks for people to think about. Is the AI just a fad, or is it actually doing the really important work of supporting teachers and learners? Can you just tell us a little bit of your background? And then also, as you think about AI tutors or AI co-pilots for learners, how you think about that space?
Thanks, Ben, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm listening to our colleagues, and my head is spinning with all the different things I mentioned. So I'm an associate professor at University College London, and I've been researching artificial intelligence and education for about a decade now. But I'm a bit of a skeptic, I have to say. I've also done a lot of work for UNESCO and a lot of work for the Council of Europe, looking at these technologies. And your question was a bit of a dichotomy. Was it, did I think of A or B? And actually, I don't agree with either of the principles you put there, if I'm perfectly honest. The reality is that these technologies are out of the bottle. So there's no going back. I accept that without hesitation. And they are quite extraordinary, what they can achieve. However, I think they are fundamentally limited in what they can achieve. And it worries me greatly that people are beginning to depend on them and to give them a credibility that they really do not warrant. So I'm worried about the ways in which these tools are being embedded in products. And I'm worried about the naivety of the companies that are doing so. And then I would put it, a misunderstanding of what education's all about. I was left a class I was teaching to come to this session today, and we were discussing what is education about. And very much the argument seems to be, and is still pretty dominant, is that education is about getting information from point A to point B. Point A being the experts, the systems, and point B being the learner's head. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how actually education works and what it should be and ways in which we should be working with it. Yeah, I think I'll stop at that point, but just to add emphasis that I'm quite skeptical about many of the claims being made.
By the way, this is a safe space for AI skepticism and it will make us stronger. So thank you, Dr. Holmes. And also, when we come back to, I would encourage everyone to ask Dr. Holmes questions around efficacy and demonstration of learning, because this is also an Edtech challenge. This is not an AI challenge. Edtech has also failed to demonstrate meaningful closing of achievement gaps and so on, performance gaps in the past. So we have to confront the opportunity and the challenges for transforming learning. John.
So before John comes in, can I just respond to that very quickly?
Sure.
Because I just want to pick up on that. That was a really good point, Ben. And the point that I make in most of my talks is that today there is no, and I emphasize the word no, independent evidence at scale that any of these products do what they claim to do so safely, and there's no evidence about the wider impact on the ecosystem of the classroom and the school and wherever the education is taking place. So I think the point you brought up there, fundamentally important, and we really shouldn't be shying away from it.
Yeah. Super provocative thought. And we also have some folks in the chat around what is education for you, and some agreement around it's not just transferring information. I think we've gone past the industrial model of education and we're in new territory. I'm going to shift over to you, John. For a living, you basically work with entrepreneurs at the front edge of innovation and educational outcomes for kids, adults, university students. You really are a catalyst in our space. As you think about where we are today and where we're headed for AI tutors, what are you looking for? How are you thinking about this space?
So I'm going to take a bit of a Switzerland position here on this panel, because I am a huge fan of Pedro's work and definitely a fan of Sean's work. But I also respect Dr. Holmes's research as it relates to being a skeptic and thinking about this. Is this just a fad? And so if I am going to take that position, which is basically, do we look at AI through an asset lens or a deficit lens? I would then go and put on my researcher hat, because I represent a major research university, and say, the facts don't lie. 70% of fourth graders, eighth graders, and 12th graders can't read at grade level, right? We have an illiteracy crisis in the country. And if you look at math, it's probably half of our students are not mastering math. So what do we do with the tools that are out there to ensure that we can improve upon those facts? I'll take Sean, for example, because I'm a big fan of Khan Academy. What did he do? What did Khan Academy do? Did Khan Academy go into a room and say, ChatGPT, oh, we're going to just come up with a bunch of incredible technology and hope it works? No. What he did is he went to Mountain View and he went down to the Khan Academy labs, and he actually worked with the tools that he was building with students, and he went into a mode of co-construction. If I'm right, Sean. Right? So he was looking at research practice partnerships and really thinking about co-constructing applications, co-creating tools that would actually work through the lens of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think that's an important path forward, is how do we create research practice partnerships that push toward evidence of effectiveness with these tools. And that's what we're bound by, and that's what we consider our secret sauce at Catalyst at Penn GSE. What is the underlying research that's being used to substantiate the value propositions that are being put forth by these education edtech tools providers? And what is the evaluative methods or the evaluative models by which we can measure the impact? And I think that's critically important as we push forward with something as game-changing as AI. And when you look at Khanmigo and you look at some of the tools that are coming out there, those that really take an intentional look at the foundational research, I'd start with Bloom's 2 sigma factor, which, by the way, shouldn't be credited to Bloom. There are two researchers that Bloom was studying, their theses, their dissertation at the University of Chicago, that was looking at mastery learning and what would impact mastery at scale. And it was one-to-one tutoring, as we've learned. And then what are the evaluative models? How are we going to look at the research to ensure that the tools that are being put out there, the tools that are being used by those students at Khan Labs, are actually used in such a way that it's leading to efficacy? And what did you find at Khan? I found that the main tool, or one of the main tools that students really loved, was, why is this meaningful? Why does this matter? It's not so much that we're teaching math or we're teaching literacy, but we're doing math and we're actually engaged in the content. And so the more that we can co-construct and the more that we can co-create, I think the more we'll be looking at this through an asset lens and not be such skeptics.
Yeah, I want to give Pedro and Sean, you're building these tools as we speak. How are you thinking about, on a day-to-day basis, both the enablement that you're building and the efficacy of it?
Happy to jump in. I think one thing I just want to frame in this conversation is, we're talking about AI, but I really would want to separate, in this context, AI from LLMs, even though LLMs are just a flavor of AI. But yes, it's true that we've been doing AI in education for a while now. And even Khan Academy, we had a previous product that we kind of sunset a little while ago that leveraged AI, that was trying to kind of find and target specific gaps in your knowledge and kind of do this customized learning path. And it's not something that we think couldn't be effective in the future, and it's something we are exploring. those are a different product than LLMs coming onto the scene and helping students and teachers in a natural language form, and really obviously kind of a lot more than that. Even though they're not, AGI, they can feel quite intelligent, and they can definitely help students and teachers with a lot of stuff. And so it's not surprising that there's no evidence that hasn't been able, haven't proven with efficacy studies yet that those can help students and teachers en masse, because they are brand new technologies. So when it comes to our approach in how we're building this, and as John mentioned, thanks John for the background there of some of what we're doing, but yeah, we are really co-creating this with a lot of different school districts, going to get a diversity of school districts who are willing to be pilot districts with us and give us feedback along the way. And so come that in a very tight collaborative loop, listening to what teachers are asking for, what student engagement is. I think, like John mentioned, student engagement is a critical piece of this. And yeah, one of the things that students really cared about the most was this button of, why should I care about learning this? And the AI would say, well, you care about, and then they could say, well, I care about becoming an athlete, and they can relate something to biology. It's just it's a bit of a different experience than we've ever been able to offer before. So I think I totally understand the skepticism, but I also think the jury is definitely not out yet, given that this is just such a new technology.
I wholeheartedly agree that, like, what we'd like to add here is that these lenses of co-creation are also really useful when you think about the student-companion relationship. So to give you some example, like one of our first early iterations of Ursula was maybe students get a quiz, and then if they get it wrong, they have like a chatbot with some context comes up, and they can answer, can guide the conversation to help the student figure out why he was wrong and how he can do better next time. And the engagement rates there were abysmal. So but after a while, on one of our most recent iterations, the students chat with an LLM that assumes the role of a poet. And the poet keeps asking them, what are you interested in? Oh, like nature, that's amazing. Like there is this whole movement of poetry from centuries ago that was about nature. Like, how does nature make you feel? And then they go through this process of figuring out what they learn. They figure out what they like. And at the end of it, they have a whole poem that they wrote with the LLM that assumed this role of poet. And engagement rates there are amazing. Like every single time that we empower students to create by leveraging LLMs, the engagement rates are really successful. So this happened in math when they have to figure out where to apply this whole thing that they've learned, just as Sean mentioned. Like maybe they've learned math and now they know that they can apply this to their day-to-day life because they like soccer or whatever. Or they figure out that they have to analyze what an LLM wrote and try to see if they find any inconsistencies that sometimes are there on purpose. So they develop these critical thinking skills. So I'd say that this lenses of co-creation is twofold. First, you have to co-create with school districts and people that are out there in the trenches as well. But also when you enable students to co-create with the LLM, that's where you get the full power of this new technology that has just emerged.
So I'm hearing a theme of, by creating increased engagement and also elevating to metacognition, like the theory of change is that we're going to get better outcomes for students. And I harkens back to when I was a school leader, we often talked about rigor, relevance, and relationships are key to student success. So let's go to the relationship side. And turns out our audience has better questions than I do. So let's start with the first audience question to that degree around what is the role of the adult educator, and both in K-12, higher ed, and workforce. So if you think it's the same or if you think it's different across those, be curious to hear your thoughts. But the question is, in the age of AI tutor and unprecedented teacher shortage, how do you think about AI tools' impact on the K-12 or higher education workforce? Are TA graders in colleges irrelevant? Are tutors in high school, will they be irrelevant? Who would like to take this one first? Feel free to jump in.
So I'll just jump in. I think on this question, we have to again look at the research. The research shows that teachers cannot be replaced by AI tutors or AI assistants. Teachers are absolutely critical in this work, and I think the word assistant has to be underscored in terms of efficacy and where this is going. I also think, as we think about research, and Dr. Holmes can weigh in on this, I think we have to ask two different questions. One is, does it work? Does AI in education work? And the second is AI in education safe and ethical? So I think they're two different questions. And I think over time we can measure whether it works in terms of providing that assistance with the aid of AI. But then I think the second question is really important in terms of what's going to happen as it relates to the ethical issues in AI. For instance, we were in a co-creation session with a high school in Southwest Florida, Dunbar High School. And we asked a framing question as we were about to unveil this chatbot. And we said, Google or Bing, just to see how the students were thinking about search engines. And they all laughed at us old, crazy interviewers. And they said, Mr. Gamba, Google or Bing? No, DuckGo. And I said, Duck what? I didn't, at the time and they said, because they don't take your personally identifiable information. And so students are really thinking about this idea of, how is information being used? How is it being commercialized? Are these applications safe? And I think this really raises some critically important issues as we push forward in this field. Both, what are we going to do to optimize or enable or actualize the tools that are actually working to address and drive deeper learning? But also, what are we doing to ensure that the ethical and the safety issues are in place in such a way that we don't open up this crazy can of worms and do more harm than good?
Dr. Holmes, as you read this question, what comes to mind?
To pick up on what John was saying, I actually three questions. So I agree with the efficacy question, I agree with the safety question, but I think the third question is, what is the impact on the ecosystem of the classroom, of the relationships between teachers and students? And that speaks to this question. I think this idea that the unprecedented teacher shortage, which I accept, the idea that can be solved by the use of these tools, I think is tragic. John also mentioned, but it's been mentioned a couple of times, that this technology is new. Well, tech is not new. Skinner, the behaviorist, was created his first teaching machine in the 1930s. And my point is, here we are nearly 100 years later, and there is still no evidence at scale that any of these tools do anything. And they are very often quite sexy, quite exciting. They don't actually do any of the things that we think they should be doing. There's often sort of anecdotal evidence of where they've done wonderful things in this setting or that setting, but as soon as you try and move it to a bigger setting, an alternative context, those things just fade away. So the point is, we still do not know today whether any edtech actually does what we claim is claimed that it does, and whether it does it safely, and what the impact is on classrooms. So for this particular question, I think it's hugely worrying. I remember maybe 6 years ago, it'll come to me, the big organization that does the big challenges, the X Prize. And they did an X Prize challenge for AI teacher. And I had the conversation at the time and said, well, this is ridiculous. I was saying, how can we say, we have to remember the importance of the human relationship within the classroom. So how on earth can we have an AI teacher? And he said to me that, Wayne, the point is that you forget all of these classrooms in the US perhaps, but particularly in developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, rural areas, etc., where there are not enough expert human people there teaching the quality education that those students have a human right to. And that stopped me in my tracks. How do I address that? But I have realized far more recently that actually it still doesn't answer the question, because if it had tools, and we don't, that could do the role of a teacher, and we won't have such tools in my lifetime, I guarantee that. If we did have those tools, we put them into those classrooms, let's assume that classroom has internet access. Let's assume that classroom has electricity. Many of them don't have either of those things. Let's assume it has both of those things. You know, many of those classrooms actually have an engineer who is capable of fixing the computer when it's not doing what it should do. So the chances are, if we have these AI tutors and we put them into classrooms, they may work for the immediate cohort. They may be very exciting, but the school government body might think we've solved the problem. But I guarantee within weeks, if not a quarter time, it's all going to collapse. These tools, there is no evidence. So to use these tools, and a point that Sean made, it's all very new. It is very new, but the AI in education world is 50 years old, right? These tools have been developed for education for 50 years, and yet there's no independent evidence of scale for the efficacy and safety of them. So AI is going to change everything. You know, John talks about the ethics. I couldn't agree more. But when we're talking about these large language models, particularly from companies like OpenAI, who train their large language models, not trained them, but actually had them checked by the ghost workers in countries like Kenya, pay $2 an hour to look at really horrific outputs that the original ChatGPT was generating. You know, do we not talk about that as well? Why do we not talk about the ways in which these LLMs can completely screw up gender assignments? So you write the word nurse, it still assumes it's a woman. You write the word lawyer, it still assumes it's a man. This happens. And the idea that we can put in enough checks and balances to stop this happening, it's just not true. There are so many examples online where the latest models are still generating utter nonsense, racist, sexist, disgusting nonsense. And yet we're suggesting that we can put these into our schools and that it could help teachers and help students. I find the whole idea incredibly worrying. I'm not trying to, you have no doubt that both Pedro and Sean are people who have the best will in the world, who are doing nothing other than trying to help students learn. And I apologize if it sounds like I'm being critical of them as individuals. I'm not. I completely understand that they're experts in their field. But I'm taking a step back and I'm worrying about the entire project.
Yeah. Again, interesting. Two things. One, say on the research of efficacy and this idea that some tools or some practices show evidence in some contexts and then don't translate to the full context. I think anybody who's been in the education system understands that there's a confluence of events that come together to enable efficacy. One of those would be structure, like basic safety, and I think everyone on the panel has said hiring educators. And another thing that I think everyone joined who's from the edtech sector understands is implementation is like 95% of the efficacy. If you're implementing well, you're supporting effective pedagogy, it's really not about the tech. It's about the teaching and learning and the changing of the teaching and learning to support learners. And so I think where this question is coming from and some of the other questions is more of a fait accompli, Dr. Holmes, that the genie is out of the bottle, but also that the shortage of human beings is profound and permanent. And so I think there's a pragmatism. There's both an idealism and potentially naivete, but also a pragmatism about like, hey, given these conditions, how do we think about it? And the last thing I would just say before I pass it over to Sean and Pedro, who are coming this day to day, is I also appreciate the global perspective, Dr. Holmes. You know, still we in developed world think that it's 99.9% broadband penetration. But, you know, in developing countries, there's 40 to 60% of the population that can't access any online learning whatsoever. And so one of the World Economic Forum goals by 2030 is to have all kids, so that would be essentially 1 billion learners or more, having just online access as like a precondition for them to be able to effectively connect and learn. So Pedro and Sean, as you think about the role of educators and particularly with your products, how do you think about, you know, Amigo and Ursula and how you assist or support the educators and also to broaden it, the parents too, you know, adults who are supporting learners?
Yeah. Sorry, Sean. Thank you. I think Brazil is in a pretty good spot to experiment with this. Like, Brazil is a country where more than 90% of families have access to at least one cell phone with internet. Pretty well connected, but also it has the worst ratio of teachers to students in the world. So the average teacher in Brazil has to take care of 40 students, the average one. Like sometimes it's even worse. This is where the role of intentional design can come in. So I'll give you an anecdote of what you're doing here in Ursula and how you try to empower educators to do their best work. So there is one particular student that kept asking a lot of questions, like to learn history. Kids shadow historical figures inside Ursula. So he kept asking every single like Roman emperor that he found how he could become an emperor himself, right? So he was flagged as a very curious kid, and we went ahead and like showed this report to their parents and teachers, and a caring teacher that really doesn't have the time or the energy to get to know this student on a personal level had something to relate to him. And he could come up in class and say, oh, hey, like, I've seen that you're really interested in the Roman Empire. Like, do you want to chat about it? Like some resources you can use to keep studying, right? So my role here at Ursula, and I think the role of Sean as well, is trying to steward this direction of how you can make this technology a source of empowerment for teachers. How do you make learning more visible? How do you make sure they have access to real-time information of their students so that a caring teacher can do the best work of their lives? Like maybe there's someone out there that thinks you can completely replace human connection aspect of education. I don't think that's the case. At least the company that we're in and the world I want to live in, that's not it. But I think there are ways, and I've seen ways that this can help a student connect better with their parents, have something to say at the dinner table, or have parents feel proud of something their kid has created, while also empowering teachers to go ahead and know their students on a more personal level that they wouldn't get to know if they were stuck in a classroom with 40 other kids.
Yeah, I agreed with that, Pedro. I think the opportunity to make learning more interactive and more human-like in the classroom is, I think, all of our goals. And I think regardless of skepticism of AI and LLMs or not, I think we can all agree that ideally the classroom is a more human experience, of just independent. I'm just stuck and doing my homework on a piece of paper or on a computer. And I think the one thing I just want to connect this to is, it means our goal at Khan Academy as well. Our goal is to empower teachers to be able to free up their time for more of that, experimentation work, project-based work. I think the reality with teachers, going back to that original question of, the role of teachers, I don't think anyone at Khan Academy would say that the role of teachers is that we're going to replace them with AI. The reason why we frame Conmigo as an assistant rather than a teacher is because it really is there to assist teachers, not to replace them. Ideally, rather than having, in a classroom of 30 where everybody is struggling with a different concept, maybe only 5 are putting their hands up rather than 15. And I think one of the reasons why we do have this, epidemic of teacher shortage at the moment is because right now the reality is that they're burnt out. A lot of them are just leaving the field altogether because it's a really challenging field to be in, and it's only getting more challenging. So I think for us, when it comes to building these tools, a lot of it is how can we help teachers, and we're working directly with teachers, co-creating these solutions, rapidly iterating based on their feedback. And so, yeah, I think our goal is how can we free students up to do more of that creative work? How can we, I think one of the key things is how can we shorten feedback loops? I'll give you another example. One of the things that we are interested, or that we're looking to do right now, is build some tools to help give students immediate feedback on things like essays. And I think the way that the essay writing works today in schools, and I definitely think we would probably all agree that the way schools are working today is also not optimal. So it's not about, ultimately it's about how do we just make inch things towards a better place. But one thing we're exploring is this notion of, well, the essay writing works today is you as a student write an essay in your little corner, you hand it to your teacher gives you a grade back in a week. But by the time you get all that red ink on your paper or comments on your Google Doc, you're not in the headspace of remembering what it is that you wrote or why you wrote it, or do you even care by the time you get that feedback 1 week later? And I think the potential with things like LLMs is to be able to give you some immediate feedback as you're writing that essay, so that maybe what you submit ends up being a instead of submitting that 50% paper, you submit a 70% paper, and you're getting that immediate feedback along the way. And that's just not something a teacher could ever do unless you have the ability to have a one-on-one tutor. Just most kids don't have access to that. You have to be a lot more privileged and wealthy. So I think there's an aspect here where we can help students who just don't have that access at scale. And I think that's pretty exciting.
Well, Sean, that's such a great point of like where the value add can be in terms of feedback cycles and kind of the relevance of it for the learning. But also from a teacher standpoint, you were talking a little bit about kind of the burnout and all of that, taking some of the heavy lifting off. I will just also note that at the beginning, you noted the difference between LLM and AI-enabled apps. I think some of the fear on LLMs is the bias of the LLM is just to give you the right answer. Whereas an app such that you and Pedro are building can actually ask a better question or provide feedback that helps you move to better learning. But I guess the inverse of this, so if AI is helping the student learn, what are the skills of the educator? So we have this great question from Roberta Fabrizi, from STEM education specialist at We School in Milano, Italy. Maybe John, can I throw this over to you? Because you often sit at the intersection of schools, educators, and innovators. What do you think the skill set is going to need to be for educators to thrive in this world where AI is out of the bottle?
So I think it starts with being a data-driven instructor and really being how many incredible so-called edtech products and services are out there that aren't even being used. They're sold to a decision maker, they get implemented, and they're not used. I think it's interesting how many solution providers are not only creating applications that are student-facing, but a lot of applications that are teacher-facing. Teaching teachers how to be data-driven, teaching teachers how to use some of these virtual assistants, these bots, these AI-driven solutions in the classroom to assist with what they do well. To some of the questions that have been asked in the chat too, I think there is an opportunity for this to address inequity worldwide because of what we're seeing in terms of the overall landscape. I also think that it's important as we kind of the end that we have to lose by not implementing some of these latest and greatest technologies, as long as we're mindful of efficacy, ethical issues, and what the place of the teacher is. Think about it again. 70% of America's K-12 students can't read. Teach in the Wharton School and ask last summer, how many of you are using ChatGPT? And no one raised their hand. This summer, I asked, and 100% of the students raised their hand. Of course, I asked next, how many of you using it to cheat? And 10 kids raised their hand real quick and then put it down. And they're like, oh my gosh. But I mean, about how transformative that is in the education space, which tends to move at a glacial pace. In 1 year, 0% of students were using ChatGPT, and 365 days later, 100% adoption. Therefore, asking these critical questions about efficacy, ethics, and role of the teacher, we need to be to co-create. We need to be implementing research practice partnerships, which are tracking the implementation of these applications to determine if there's actual delivery of efficacy through the lens of equity. I think that's critically important, Ben, as we continue to push forward in this space.
And one thing that those students are definitely not doing is going to ChatGPT and saying, be a Socratic tutor and make sure to not give me the answer, but guide me to those steps. And I think that, going directly to the raw models is quite a different experience than going to something that is more augmented towards education that I think can help them in a way that isn't just giving away the answer. So I think there's a lot of benefits to different flavors of these things in different contexts.
So we are going to move to final thoughts here.
Hold
on, Dr. Holmes, just real quick. We're going to move to final thoughts here. So I'd love, and feel free, Dr. Holmes, you're up next. Audience is a range of educators in the classroom, administrators, entrepreneurs. Advice would you have for them as they think about their work and AI, and kind of things to look for or things to be conscious of that you would kind of leave them with? So, Dr. Holmes, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think the first thing is, AI have the potential to transform education. Yes, it does. The question is it going to transform it in ways that are worth transforming? And that's the real worry. And all the evidence that I've seen to date suggests that's not what is happening. I just have to say this, mate. You a lovely person, I have no doubt. I'm impressed by how your answer about what you think your tools can do. You virtually quoted verbatim what B.F. Skinner said in the 1930s. The things you said it can do is what he was arguing then. It didn't happen then. It's not happening now. So the question is, what do we do now? What advice can we give to teachers? The biggest advice I give is be critical of what you're being offered. Really break it down. Really think about the kind of things that are being suggested here. Do they save you time? Possibly. But anything that saves you time also takes the nuance, the skill, the expertise out of your hands. I say to my students, if you want to use these tools, that's up to you. And that might help you pass. What it's not going to help you do is do anything to any standard, any quality, any nuance. That's a huge problem. And we need our teachers to be aware of that. When these tools work, what they do is they take the beauty, the complexity of the real world, and they squidge it down and they reproduce an output, just really standardized approaches. So yes, it might help you move forward a little bit. And yes, it might look as though it's a bit different for you. But the chances are that the more these tools are used throughout education, it's just going to make education worse and worse. Sorry to be really negative here, but I worry so much. And, it also occurs to me, if we talk about Khan Academy, Khan Academy has pivoted 3 times in its history. Well, why does it keep pivoting? Well, because what it's doing, it knows wasn't right the first time. I look forward to 5 years' time when Khan Academy pivots again, when they start realizing that the LLMs are actually doing not what they hoped at all.
Dr. Holmes, I'm going to stop you there. I think one way to interpret things. The other would be that there's layers of efficacy where the addition of more material, more content, more engagement has actually improved the impact of the platform. So we'll just, on that one, we're going to agree to disagree strongly. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sean and Pedro, and then John, you could close this out. And Pedro, you're living this every day. What advice do you have for the people who are trying to build and really trying to create a transformative impact?
Yeah, say that my advice would be to really avoid falling down this rabbit hole of trying to use LLMs and pure chatbots to solve everything. As you said in the beginning of our session, Ben, AI is not a product, and the whole beauty of it is building the product and the whole environment where students can have this sense of wonder and want to explore education on their own terms. AI can help them do that by having them engage with it on an emotional level and also connecting the dots between the real world and what they're seeing. But just writing a good prompt and using ChatGPT is not enough to create a sustainable long-term product. Learn is a huge issue for everyone working with LLMs right now. And the way you avoid this is by being really thoughtful on the human behind the screen and how this environment works. Text only is not the way to go. I would say that audio only, at least in our experiences, have also shown to not be enough. So there is some deep work to be done here, how do experiences that tailor themselves in the age of LLMs. I'm not sure yet, I'm trying to figure this out, but just be wary of this rabbit hole and try to create a really beautiful product that people love instead of just using AI as a panacea for everything.
Sean.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So one thing I just want to say is thank you to Dr. Holmes for the skepticism. I would say the reason why I say that is because there's plenty of people, even within our team at Khan Academy, who were also skeptics. And I think all of the skepticism that they brought to the table with things like, how can we make sure that this is done more safely? How can we monitor? How can we, this in the most efficacious way as possible? It made the product better. So I welcome skepticism. I think it strengthens our industry and our product. So I'm not against it. And in terms of efficacy, I did share a link, Dr. Skinner. So Dr. Holmes, I do want to make sure that present the head of efficacy at our company. She'd be remiss if I didn't share that. In terms of my advice that I would give to everybody who is here listening to us today, I would just say that the most important thing really is to both just try to jump in and build, but build and co-create with experts in the field, build with learning science experts, build with teachers, build with learners, get rapid feedback, look at the data, and iterate as quickly as you can. Don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. It's an exciting space. I do not share the skepticism. I think that this space is very exciting, and I think it can be truly transformative, but in a way that I think can be empowering for teachers, empowering for learners. Good luck building to everybody.
Great. John, take us home.
So, great mentor and researcher told me, show me the evidence and invoke doubt. And I think that's what Dr. Holmes is insisting upon, because we've gotten a little bit drunk with the hype related to AI. Teachers, dip your toe in the water, try some things, give it a whirl. For my administrators and leaders, do a lot of professional development, find the experts who know the applications that can assist in this space to drive toward mastery with the assistance of EdTech. As a person who represents a major research university, I'll say we're building off of the work of Live in the Swamp, which was co-authored by a hero of mine, Caitlin Donnelly from Avalanche Ventures. They looked at thousands of EdTech products and they said, yes, Dr. Holmes, many of them don't work, but which ones did and why? And what the research shows is if you're focused on engagement of students, and Sean hit this well, as did Pedro, pedagogical alignment, that we're driving toward deeper learning and mastery and can measure the impact, and it's easy to adopt, you have a great chance of being one of the 45 unicorns in the EdTech space that has emerged and developed. And if you can do all of that through the lens of ethical awareness and being sensitive about what this is doing to teachers in the classroom, parents and communities, we're going to continue to be on the right track. And I personally think Pedro and Sean and the work they're doing is definitely designing, developing, co-constructing through that lens. And I'm excited to see what's next for them and a lot of the EdTech solution providers who are forth products and services through our continuum of programming at Catalyst at Penn GSE.
Wonderful. Well, this is just the beginning, both for AI being out of the bottle, but also for this dialogue. I also want to just appreciate the courage of our panel to dive in fully in a 45-minute session. And if you want to dive in, you can meet our panel in the lounge at the table and follow up with any of your questions. And so, John, thanks so much for putting your LinkedIn in there. Feel free to reach out to everyone. We're going to end the session now. We'll see you in the lounge.
Thank you, everyone.